Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and good evening to you and my colleagues in the House this evening. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by thanking my colleague from Nanaimo Cowichan for bringing this bill C-638, to the House of Commons. It's an important bill. It addresses an important series of issues that I'm going to take a few minutes to explain for Canadians who are watching or following the proceedings here around this debate. It's important for us to remember that in such an area, such an issue, Mr. Speaker, it's our view here in the Liberal Party of Canada that we really do have to show, as a federal government, the federal government has to show leadership in an area that crosses jurisdictions, that involves such a variety of important issues. And in my remarks, I want to also acknowledge the incredibly good work that my colleague, the Liberal member from Cardigan, is doing as a long-time supporter of action in this area, and someone we look to in our own caucus, Mr. Speaker, for leadership when it comes to issues around ports and our waterways and, of course, our oceans policy. He's been a long-time fisheries critic and beyond. So this bill really does deal with the challenge of derelict and abandoned vessels, which are a very serious concern for our shorelines, our harbour authorities, for property owners, for communities, for orders of government. These can create real problems, Mr. Speaker, in our waterways. They can cost all kinds of money in terms of having them repaired or removed. They create obstacles in our waterways. To reiterate, there are, of course, the implicit and explicit environmental issues that surround this question of abandoned and derelict vessels. And it's expensive. This is an expensive issue for Canada, and it's not one that's going away. There are 2.6 million pleasure craft licensed in Canada today, Mr. Speaker. This is a problem that's not going away. The order of magnitude is simply growing. So there's a financial burden here that's falling on community organizations, on municipal or provincial governments, or even property owners. And so one of the problems we see when we look at the work of the member from Nanaimo Cowichan that she's trying to address in her bill that we support is this issue of who's in charge. It seems like everybody's job is nobody's job when it comes to this important issue, which is both on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and I dare say is, I'm sure, in play as well when it comes to our northernmost shorelines. So it's important to clarify which agency or order of government or body is in charge of different situations. We need to make sure that we identify all possible measures that can be taken to identify and locate the owners of the wrecks, for example. So there is confusion which reigns in this area. Sometimes it's Transport Canada. The Minister of Transport can become involved where if the vessel is causing an obstruction or is blocking navigation, for example. Well, yet again, Mr. Speaker, other times it's the Canadian Coast Guard. When the Canadian Coast Guard is called in to deal with threats around pollution, as we saw recently on the west coast of Canada in another episode where the Coast Guard was dispatched to play a role with a major leak. Of course, are then in a position to recover their expenses, recover the cost of its expenses to deal with that pollution from the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund. But the problem is, once that's been dealt with, if the pollution's been dealt with and the sources of the pollution are dealt with, Mr. Speaker, the Coast Guard doesn't have the authority by itself to be able to then move and deal with the derelict vessel, the abandoned vessel, the problem vessel. And this is a real situation for so many of our harbors right around the country. Then again, if this abandoned or derelict vessel, this problem vessel, as I might describe it, isn't a major environmental concern, and if it's not posing a problem when it comes to navigation, most of the time there is no action taken by government. And they can remain a real problem, not just because they're an eyesore, not just because they affect local residents in one way or another, but because they can very well be hazardous. And they're hazardous for the good folks who administer and run our harbors and our harbor authorities. And they've become very expensive. This is a very expensive proposition for harbors right across the entire country. In fact, one of the most powerful voices I have seen in this area is the voice of the National Harbor Authority Advisory Committee that stated that, quoted, "The truth is that one sinking of a derelict vessel at your harbor can bankrupt the harbor authority. It's that simple. We need to find a solution for it. This is going to be an issue right across the country," close quote. That's Ben Maberly from the National Harbor Authority Advisory Committee. Well, he's right. This is a very important issue. And I understand, Mr. Speaker, there was a study performed several years ago at Fisheries Committee, a very important foundational study, and it examined very carefully this whole question. The report was entitled "Small Craft Harbors, an Essential Infrastructure Managed by and for Fishing Communities." It dealt with this very issue, and it recommended, specifically recommended, that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, DFO, make changes, and legislative changes in particular, so that the removal of abandoned and derelict vessels from harbors was facilitated. And as a result of that report, frankly, nothing has happened. The government has done nothing. We've just come through a budget cycle. We're still in the midst of it, in fact. There's nothing significant in the budget to deal with this issue, as many of our authorities, harbor authorities, are struggling with, as I said earlier, with these particularly expensive problems. And it's hard to reconcile that, Mr. Speaker, with the fact that at DFO, since this government's come to power, there's been $1 billion of unspent resources. That could have been properly applied, in our view, to provide assistance to these harbor authorities and other parties that are involved in trying to do right by their communities and their citizens and taking action. So nothing in the budget was brought to bear to address the specific challenges in our harbors and wharfs, with our harbors and wharfs when it comes to this issue. And there's still a lingering problem, Mr. Speaker, with the fact that harbors themselves don't have the authority and, more importantly, don't have the budget to deal with wrecks and with abandoned and derelict vessels. We need legislative changes. Why is that? Well, because we need to help with the removal of such vessels. And given the fact that, as I said earlier, 2.6 million pleasure craft licensed in Canada today, numbers growing, fleet aging, we need a long-term plan. Something that's been asked for by the committee's report, by harbor authorities, by communities, by municipalities, by stakeholders and NGOs, civil society actors. People are rightly concerned, and there is no long-term plan after almost a decade of Conservative government to deal with this. Because that requires leadership, Mr. Speaker. And leadership means you have to pull together different orders of government to work together to come up with a plan that allows for us to respond to this nationally, as a nation, as a country. This bill goes some distance in contributing to legislative improvements, and for that reason we support it. It helps by designating the Canadian Coast Guard as the receiver of wrecks, by requiring the receiver of wrecks to take responsible steps to determine and locate the owners of these wrecks. That's important. Who owns these things? Because you can't simply walk away, you can't abandon. There's a responsibility. And it gives a new power to the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to bring in new regulations. And these would have to be followed by the owners of these wrecks to remove, to dispose, or destroy them. So it's a positive step. It requires the Minister of Transport to file a report every 5 years, for example, before each House of Parliament. So we have a better idea with respect to Part 7 of the Act and the operations that it governs. So we think this can be a very powerful next step, Mr. Speaker. It can help to deal with these prohibitively high costs And just in closing, if I could say, funding will be key. And if you're going to see any kind of national leadership in this regard, coupled with some of the legislative changes that my colleague from the NDP is bringing, we hope we can make improvements here, but it does require national leadership, something which heretofore and up to this point simply has not materialized under the Conservative government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your time.
Reprise de débat, resuming debate. L'honorable député de